Hi, this is Tom Lombardo, Director of the Center for Future Consciousness, and all three parts of this video presentation can be found on my website, centerforfutureconsciousness.com, along with references and a text of the entire narration. This is Science Fiction, the Mythology of the Future, Part 1. What is science fiction, and why is it so popular? On this magazine cover is Braxa, a Martian holding a rose, as a symbol and a gift of her bittersweet connection between herself and the human character who has impregnated her, saving the Martian race from extinction. A Rose for Ecclesiastes, a story included in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, was written in 1963 by Roger Zelazny, and it contradicts the techno-stereotype of science fiction. It is a humanistic tale taking place on Mars. It is a story of religion and fate and fatalism about the future, of love and seduction, of mysticism versus rationalism. The central character is a poet and a linguist, not a scientist or a technologist. Science fiction is clearly the most visible and influential contemporary form of futurist thinking in the modern world. Science fiction is so popular because it speaks to the whole person, intellect, imagination, and emotion, and stimulates holistic consciousness. Although not all science fiction deals with the future, its primary focus has been on the possibilities of the future. In this regard, science fiction can be defined as a literary and narrative approach to the future involving plots, storylines, and action sequences, specific settings, dramatic resolutions, and varied and unique characters, human and otherwise. It is imaginative, concrete, and often highly detailed scenario building about the future set in the form of stories. The Allegory of Surface Tension by James Blish, another story included in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. This story involves tiny little creatures who live in a puddle of water and escaping from that puddle of water in a rocket ship that they build, and for the first time seeing beyond the confines of their very tiny reality and seeing the stars. It represents the transcending of the boundaries of imagination, of one's worldview, of present reality. It highlights the importance of courage and breaking through the constraints of the normal. It involves the discovery that the cosmos extends vastly beyond present reality and thinking. And indeed, that is science fiction. Let's compare myth, fantasy, and science fiction. Humans in myth and fantasy have been creating stories and visions of strange lands, incredible adventures, and fantastical beings since the beginnings of recorded history. Look at these images, on one hand from fantasy and myth, and on the other hand from science fiction, of spirits versus rocket ships, angels versus robots, dragons versus aliens. The left ones perhaps seem scientifically implausible, whereas the right ones seem much more plausible. But notice the similarities in imagery and meaning between the left and the right. Indeed, if we compare the power of myth with the power of science fiction, we find a great number of similarities. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Muriel Rukeyser. The truth and value of the universe is revealed through narrative rather than through facts or theories. On the right-hand side, we see Prometheus and David Bowman from 2001, Prometheus stealing the fire, Bowman being given the light, metaphorically the power and knowledge of the gods, or in Bowman's case of a highly advanced alien species, and we see a similarity in meaning and imagery there. Indeed, between myth and science fiction we find both are narrative and involve drama, both involve personification, that is, personified characters in the stories. Both deal with archetypal themes such as good and evil, birth, death, and resurrection. Both illustrate and teach ethics and values. Both educate on deep principles of reality. Both inspire and generate emotional reactions. Both provide personal cosmic connection. On one hand, myth tends to connect past with future rather strongly, whereas science fiction throws more of a primary emphasis on the future. The main difference, though, between them is that regarding the invention of fantastical realities, in myth and fantasy, it has been informed by classical thought, religion, and mythology, and concepts of divine providence, versus those fantastical realities imagined in science fiction are informed by science, contemporary thought, and the Enlightenment theory of progress. That is, for science fiction, the strange and the different is set in the future. It's set in the context of evolution and progress. The future will not be the same as the present. Science fiction as the mythology of the future. From Olaf Stapledon. Our aim is not merely to create aesthetically admirable fiction. We must achieve neither mere history nor mere fiction, but myth. A true myth is one which, within the universe of a certain culture, expresses richly and often perhaps tragically the highest aspirations possible within a culture. The idea that science fiction is the mythology of the future means two different things. Number one, our contemporary myths about the future are in fact science fiction. But secondly, the myths that will inform us and inspire us in the future will be science fiction. The double-edged sword of science fiction. Hope and fear, terror and wonder. These are the days of miracle and wonder. Paul Simon. Nightmares are dreams whose usefulness is to keep us on our toes. J.T. Frazier. Science fiction evokes both negative and positive anticipatory emotions about the future. Science fiction is not simply about inventive thought and technology and imagination, but it's psychologically holistic, including emotional and psychological dimensions as critical. It moves and stimulates the reader, both positively and negatively. The philosophy of Romanticism, passion and distrust. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Aside from the theory of enlightenment, a second development in modern times which stimulated the emergence of science fiction was Romanticism. The philosophy of enlightenment provoked positive emotions, hopes, and visions of the future. But Romanticism was critical of the Enlightened vision of rational scientific progress. It was doubtful whether indeed reason was the road or the exclusive road to the future. Romanticism emphasized the centrality of emotion in human life, as opposed to simply reason, and the future, over rationality and technology. Frankenstein is frequently identified as the first modern science fiction novel. Hence, science fiction seems to begin with fear, inclusive of fear of the unknown as well as fear regarding progress and silence. It involves stealing the fire, the light, creativity, the power of the gods, playing God through science and technology. But due to our limitations and our flaws in our own psyche, it backfires and destroys the creator. This indeed is the pervasive warning theme in science fiction. Do we have faith in ourselves and in our inventions? As Brian Aldiss said, Frankenstein is the modern theme, touching not only science but man's dual nature, whose inherited ape curiosity has brought him both success and misery. The Extraordinary Adventures of Jules Verne. Optimism and progress and the scientific romance. With Verne, indeed, we do have faith. We have faith in technology, we have faith in progress, we have faith in human nature. The Extraordinary Voyages, a series of novels written by Jules Verne, through the 1860s and 1870s constitutes our next step in looking at the history of science fiction. According to Verne, these voyages encompass both the Earth and the universe. They are adventure stories written with style. They were immensely popular, embodying a belief in both science and technology and the positive qualities of the human spirit. Verne extensively studied and incorporated ongoing scientific and technological advances into his stories, such as Mysterious Island and Journey to the Center of the Earth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But now we come to a darker image. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds, as ours are to those beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. From the War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells. War of the Worlds was a science fiction novel that H.G. Wells wrote in 1897 or 1898. But Wells wrote both nonfiction as well as fiction about the future, and is often identified as both the father of modern science fiction and the father of modern future studies. Indeed, he created a multiplicity of visions and predictions about the future in his science fiction stories and novels such as those that are up on the screen right now. Utopian and dystopian novels, tales of scientific invention and terror. He anticipated aerial warfare, the atomic bomb, a world brain, the Second World War. There were great stretches of imagination, such as his notion of the time machine, an invasion of aliens, and the invisible man that Wells was noted for. Wells, in fact, felt the awe and wonder of the future and of science fiction, of the deep, vast possibilities of evolution and time. It is possible to believe that all the past is but the beginning of a beginning, and that all that is and that has been is but the twilight of the dawn. It is possible to believe that all that the human mind has ever accomplished is but the dream before the awakening. Evolution, future histories, global ethical utopianism, and despair. Wells' visions of history and the future were based upon the theory of evolution, which informed him in everything that he wrote. As I noted, he wrote many nonfiction works between the years 1901 to 1945. He was an advocate of positive social and technological change, of the establishment of a world government to eliminate hostilities between nations and the spirit of nationalism. But having observed 2 world wars while he was alive, he ends in a feeling of despair on the future viability of humans and human civilization in his book Mine at the End of Its Tether. But the other books up here on this slide are good examples of Wells' non-fictional writings with respect to how to create a positive future, which he wrote simultaneously, often with his science fiction. The father of science fiction cinema and special effects, the creative, fantastical, surrealistic visions of George Milanes. It's important to consider the visual and cinematic media in describing the evolution of science fiction. But just as soon as people were beginning to write modern science fiction, they were also beginning to create movies that had science fiction themes and elements. Milanes is the most noteworthy of these early creators of science fiction and fantastical movies. 2 of his most noteworthy are A Trip to the Moon in 1902 and The Impossible Voyage in 1904. He produced numerous fantasies, horror movies, science fiction, historical sagas. In fact, he created over 500 movies between 1896 and 1913. He invented hundreds of special effect techniques, which serve as the ground or the foundation for what would come later in the 20th century. As indeed we come into the 20th century, it is a bright and terrible new century, and science fiction literature delves into futurist cities, the collapse of human civilization, rockets and space travel, aliens and other worlds, mighty machines and fantastical inventions, lost lands and terrifying beasts, airplanes and air wars, tanks, world wars, and atomic weapons. There is both hope and fear as we pass into the new century, as we are moving into the First World War. Science fiction provides adventure, but escapism, predictions, and warnings, social and technological. The amazing, the wondrous, and the astounding. Science fiction becomes self-conscious, 1920 to 1938. Books, magazines, art, and film. On the left here we see Hugo Guernsbach. Hugo Guernsbach wrote in 1911 a science fiction novel called Ralph 124C 41 Plus, which literally was translated in his own mind as 124C for many. This book was serialized in 1925. Hugo Guernsbach is credited with inventing the expression science fiction. In 1923, he was using the expression scientific fiction, then scientific fiction, and finally science fiction in Science Wonder Stories, one of the early science fiction magazines he produced in 1929. Amazing Stories, which was his creation, is the first science fiction magazine that began to be published in 1926. First, he discovered and articulated the history of science fiction by initially publishing works from Verne, Wells, and Edgar Allan Poe. But eventually he began to include a lot of new science fiction writers, and through his career, indeed, he created many different science fiction magazines, emerging first in the 1920s and then later on into the 1930s. On the right here, we see Frank Paul, the father of science fiction art, and many of these amazing story and astounding story covers are from Frank Paul. He did original covers for Guernsbach, for Amazing Wonder Stories, and numerous other magazines. There were imaginative depictions of aliens and technologies, of alien worlds and civilizations. Finally, on the right, extreme right, we see John Campbell, a writer and editor who took over as editor of Astounding in 1938, which became the premier science fiction magazine in the 1940s. Campbell was interested in improving the standards of writing and storytelling. And on this slide we see Who Goes There, the classic alien thriller that Campbell wrote in the late 1930s. Campbell discovered and nurtured many of the top writers of the Golden Age. Metropolis and the robot as archetype. Fritz Lang and his wife, Thea von Harbo, created Metropolis. It came out in 1926. Metropolis was apocalyptic. It was immense and often dark in religious symbolism. It was a dystopian vision of the future. It was filled with intense emotionality, heightened sensation, madness, and the Dionysian. It was order and technology versus humanity. It was redemption and the triumph of love in the heart. The robot, in fact, symbolizes both the hope and the fear within us about our technologically empowered future self. Metropolis was the best science fiction movie made in the early years of science fiction cinema. And finally, we come to Olaf Stapledon, Cosmic Evolution and the Future of History. Stapledon was a philosophy professor in England, 1886 to 1950 were the years he lived, and he only wrote a small number of science fiction novels, but indeed he produced two of the greatest. According to Arthur C. Clarke, Starmaker is probably the most powerful work of imagination ever written, and I agree. beginning with Last and First Men. Last and First Men, which came out in 1930, goes out 2 billion years into the future, chronicling 18 species of men. It is a holistic vision of the entire future human evolution, including the physical genetic, the technological, the ecological, the social, the psychological, the spiritual, and the philosophical. But then, in 1937, Stapledon published Starmaker, which goes out 50 billion years into the future. It is philosophical cosmology and ethics set in a narrative form, encompassing a vast scope in space and time. We see a positively accelerated curve of imagination as we move through this book. We observe the diverse evolution of life, mind, intelligence, social systems, and galactic cosmic systems across the entire universe. And we eventually transcend the universe and meet God. It is the most influential science fiction novel probably ever written, containing more ideas that have been taken from it and put into other ones than any other novel that's been written within science fiction. And on transversing the entirety of cosmic evolution and seeing God, we end part 1.